Tonight we're going to talk about a place that's near and dear to all of us. Campuses like Ball State University have been a part of the American culture since a very short number of years after European settlers first arrived on this continent. And not only have those campuses been responsible for many of the great leaders in our country, but they've also been responsible for the quality of life that we enjoy so much these days. These campuses, if you look at them, are also a means of tracing many of the major developments that have occurred in our design professions: architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. And as I said, tonight we're going to talk about Ball State University. In the 100 years that Ball State has been in existence, it has grown immensely. Starting with 10 acres and 2 small buildings, our campus has grown to a community of 31,000 people, 50 major buildings, and over 1,000 acres. In these buildings and on these acres, people work and live and study. We are genuinely a community. For the past 27 years, tonight's speaker, Thomas J. Kinghorn, has been intimately involved in the shaping of this campus. As the Vice President for Business Affairs and Treasurer at Ball State University, Mr. Kinghorn has been responsible for the planning of the buildings and the procuring of funds. Tonight, I think you're going to get a whole new appreciation for the place that we all have a very warm place for. And so tonight, I'd like you to welcome Thomas J. Kinghorn.
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone. The talk was billed as an historical look at the past 100 years, and when I got involved in the preparations, I thought maybe it'd be more appropriate, maybe honesty in advertising, to call this a glance at some aspects of the development of this campus over that period of time. I think when we're finished, though, even though it will be kind of a superficial look at developments, not enough time to address the people involved, that's certainly a key element. But I think you will agree that there has been a fantastic development of this institution over a number of years, something that has far outstripped the wildest dreams of the founders of this institution. So we have an awful lot to cover. Let's move into the slides. What I'm going to do this evening is to take you through a 5-part process. I'm going to take a very brief look at the origin of campus plans in America because, as most of you know, a lot of what we do in whatever walk of life we're involved in is borrowed or copied from someone else. Where we take ideas, test them, improve them with our own input, but the campuses that developed in America owe a lot of what the thinking was to the campuses in Europe. We're going to look at some of the influences that took place as Ball State developed as a campus. We're going to identify some major planning efforts. Ball State University has never been without a comprehensive master plan as it is developed through all of these years. And that is something that is significantly different than many colleges and universities that grew up over the years. As the more I look into this, I find. We'll look at future plans and concepts and some major projects on the horizon, but that isn't the primary focus of what we're here to talk about. The primary thrust is to look at how we got to where we are. This is, of course, the great quadrangle at Oxford, and this is some architecture and an organization of space in a university that set the pattern for the development of many colleges and universities, certainly here in America. I want to we have a quadrangle, a very tightly packed quadrangle. It is the kind of facility that sends the message that inside of these halls, inside of this enclosure, great things are happening. But it's kind of a forbidding kind of a concept. I want to contrast that with some of the development that has happened in America. Next slide indicates three major planning efforts that have been identified in the early years of development of colleges and universities in the country. And there are certainly many more, but let me call attention to just three. The first is, of course, the William & Mary campus. The first, Sir Christopher Wren, someone many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with for his work in England. He's responsible for the architectural design of a number of churches. In addition to that, he had an architectural commission to design some components of the Oxford campus. And then Union College, thought of as the most successful plan over a number of years. And then, of course, the Thomas Jefferson plan at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Now, there were a lot of buildings built in America that were associated with universities through this period of time. But what we're talking about here is a concept different than building separate buildings. These plans incorporated some of these concepts. They looked at, it's probably the difference between building architecture and urban planning. They looked at the entire systems that were involved in the development of campus, and so they looked at the site conditions, they looked at architectural composition of a whole set of buildings. They adopted an overall design concept, and they thought about the buildings related to the educational enterprise. And so there are programmatic aspects that were involved. Next slide, of course, shows the college building at William & Mary. So Christopher Wren is credited as the architect on this project. He also did a plan, a town and university plan. And while it is true that the plan in its entirety did not get completed in the way that it had been planned, this was one of the first comprehensive looks at the arrangement of buildings and the associations of it. This building also is the first building in America where an architect professional is responsible for the design. Next slide shows a plan by Joseph Ramey, 1813, for Union College. And this was his rough draft plan, or his planning document, identifying a couple of things different. He reflected on the Oxford campus, for instance, and he wanted to express the concept of accessibility, of openness to a broader part of the population, which was the goal objective of this university. And so he moved the buildings out rather than having them in a tight-knit pattern. He moved them out and as a way to express that kind of openness. This plan lasted for about 150 years. This is the campus as it existed, though, 10 or 15 years ago. And you can see the overall concept with the central item here, the buildings that flank it on either side. This building right here, which was, I think, built in the early 1960s. This plan is thought to be comprehensive in nature and very successful. The next slide is a Thomas Jefferson plan. This is the plan that was developed in 1825. For those of you that have been to the campus, you already know what I'm about to tell you. But this campus was organized on, this is what is known as the lawn. These are they're identified as ranges. The whole set of grounds was a part of a compound. While it doesn't show it here, there were serpentine fences, not fences, but walls, brick walls that were here and here in order to join this compound together. These were dark areas here. These buildings here were classrooms and faculty apartments. The thought was that the faculty would have their classrooms close by, the students lived in these buildings along here and along here. And so the concept was that as many principal faculty members as they had in the college, they would need what were known then as pavilions in order to support that activity. And the students, number of residence hall rooms would be driven by the student population. If you look at what is in place today, you'll see the similarities. The pavilions along either side of the range, the kind of a quadrangle area here, and the buildings. It's an incredible plan, and if you ever get close to this campus, and you have at all any interest in campus planning, you need to spend a day there looking around, getting the story, doing him on the show, and he was certainly a remarkable person when it comes to design and architecture. But let's turn away from some of these models that we've had and look at the development of the Ball State University campus. At the time that there was any thought about another university or a training school in Muncie, Indiana, already Indiana University had been established in 1820, Purdue University 1865, Vincennes, of course, the oldest university, 1806, and Indiana Normal School had been established in 1870. In Muncie, Indiana, this is pretty much what it looked like in downtown. And this building right here is, I believe Tony called the Art Park, is that correct? And because this building has been removed, but part of this facade is left here, and that's a parking area. This building, if you go downtown Muncie today, the courthouse is over on the right-hand side. There's a blank drive-through window right there, and you see that building granted in disrepair, but with somewhat simple design. The next slide identifies another important piece of architecture. This is the Boyce Building. Civic Theater is located right here. This, of course, is a parking lot by this time. But this is kind of the character of what was going on in the late 1800s. Meanwhile, out in northwest Muncie, this is what you found at about the year 1980. This obviously is the administration building. Shortly thereafter, the president lived in an apartment up in here. I think this maybe had been the president's garage. I don't know. I won't speculate. Another thing I want you to think about as you look at this picture is look at the lack of any vegetation and how important forestation became to this campus and becomes to every place where you live and work. This campus, or this institution, had a very rocky existence. The next slide indicates from 1901 to 1917, just 16 years, it was unsuccessful on a number of occasions. It was Eastern Indiana Normal School, then called Palmer University, Muncie Normal Institute, and the Muncie National Institute. And in 1917, it was closed. It contained this building. You can see that it's going up at this point. Architectural style is similar to what it is today, though there are some changes. It would be nice to return it just to take a look. Next slide shows that building and this old residence hall built in 1902. This is a women's residence hall located in the neighborhood, which I'll show you later where it was, in the neighborhood of Lucina Hall, and 10 acres. Before I show you what the 10 acres are, this is that same residence hall. If you were looking from the administration building, let's say on the second or third floor, looking west, Tillotson Avenue is out here. This is where the hospital is now located. This is University Avenue. this roadway was vacated, obviously. And this is Christian Woods, like this. Next slide indicates that this is where the 10 acres is located. Let me get you oriented in this particular form because I'll come back to it a number of times. This is taken from the Rundell-Hertzberger Master Plan. And of course, this is the campus. This is McKinley Avenue as it comes down to the center of the campus. This is where the administration building is located. Science Hall, the original quadrangle is here. Christie Woods here. We are located right now in the building here, architecture building. The arena is up here. So 10 acres located right here. And that property in 1917 was in a receiver sale. And as indicated on the next slide, these 5 individuals, the Ball brothers, bought that derelict property with the idea that it would be given to the state of Indiana. In fact, in that same year, the Indiana General Assembly passed a statute that enabled gifts to be given to the state for educational purposes. I should say also that you might wonder why, prior to the purchase by these individuals, the development of the school was very important. In recent years, one of the efforts that is undertaken in most communities is to develop an industrial park as an economic development concept. In these days, the best idea anyone had for economic development was to start a college or a training institution of some sort. And so this was an economic development effort that went south, and these individuals bailed it out and gave it to the state of Indiana. Well, since it was under the operation of the state of Indiana, it's had a much better future, indicated in the next slide. It began, it was given to the state of Indiana as the first regional campus of Indiana State University. Indiana State University at that time was known as Eastern Division. It became the Eastern Division of Indiana State Normal. Remember, this Indiana State Normal was first established in 1870. Had a campus in Terre Haute. Not everyone was in favor of accepting this gift to the state of Indiana. The board minutes reflect a lot of conversation about additional cost. Would this, for instance, drain dollars from the Terre Haute campus? In fact, there were 5 trustees of Eastern Division of the Indiana State Normal School, and of the 5, 4 voted yes, and an individual by the name of Judge Joshua Jump voted no. He thought that this was certainly not a good investment. It might be good for the Muncie community, but it wasn't good for the state, and it certainly was not something that Indiana State Normal wanted to take on. But in 1918 they did, and because of the philanthropic attitude and effort of the Ball family in those early years, the name was changed to Ball Teachers College in 1922. In 1929, it was separated. Interesting, when the question of accepting this gift was posed, the Attorney General rendered an opinion that it could be accepted so long as it was never operated as a separate institution. It had to continue to be part of the umbrella of the normal school operation. And by 1929, different legal opinion evidently was obtained, and it became a separate institution. And then in 1965, Ball State University became a university, and interestingly enough, Indiana State achieved university status at that same time. I mentioned earlier that throughout the institution's life, there was a master plan in place for the development of the campus. And the first such plan was a plan developed by James Lowry, a landscape architect from Indianapolis. And I'll tell you a little more about how that came about. We'll look later at the Shoulder plan, the Perkins-Will plan, the Rundell-Hertzberger plan, the one that we are operating under today. Next slide identifies, and I want to say up front, I can't do justice for all that is contained in the plan and the few bullets I get to have on the slide. But the Lowry plan did a couple of major things that got this university started off in the right direction. Remember, there were 10 acres, and before 1922, the Ball family bought additional acreage. In fact, they bought 120 acres and gave the 120 acres to the state. The state decided that they wanted to accept just 60 of them and instructed the Balls to put the other 60 in a trust. The property then could be sold over a period of time, assuming that this institution needed to have some additional financial support to get started. And so there was now a much broader area to kind of plan. In 1921, when it became the time to plan the first structure, that would be the science building, now known as the Burkhart building, trustees engaged an individual by the name of Kuno Kiley, who was a Muncie architect, and he began the process of trying to develop the plans and specifications for a science building. It's kind of hard for me to ferret this out, but it took a good deal of time and a lot of discussion. And my assumption is that there wasn't complete satisfaction with the style and arrangement of buildings. And so at one of the board meetings where this was discussed, it was decided that a subcommittee should go to Chicago. Remember, this is 1921. Should go to Chicago where they could do some campus tours. They wanted to go see the Northwestern campus and the University of Chicago campus. And they were commissioned also to make other such visits as were appropriate to come to some kind of a campus plan concept. And so they did that. The individuals that went were Frank C. Ball, the individual who was, in those early years, primarily was a member of the Board of Trustees, was probably the person active in buying the campus and following through. He and a former president and the current president, James Lowry and Kubal Keibel, went to Chicago and spent 2 days visiting these campuses. When they came back, their report to the Board of Trustees was that they saw a great contrast between the campus that they witnessed at Northwestern. They were not impressed about the organization of buildings. They did not think that it had been given, at least in hindsight anyway, had been given sufficient thought. There was not continuity of design or thought process. The arrangement of buildings wasn't what they wanted. But in the University of Chicago, they found something they thought was very special. They found an architectural style, they found a compatibility, an organization of spaces that impressed them a great deal. And they came back and made the report, and the board accepted their recommendations. The decision was made at that point about the architectural style of the campuses, of the buildings that would be on that quadrant. Kuno Keibel called it early English Gothic. I know since then it's been called collegiate Gothic, but I guess nonetheless some variety of Gothic was what was adopted. And interesting, they talked about the science building not being the full interpretation of their design concept, that it would not reach that standard, that other buildings that would be built on the quadrangle would suggest more styling than they thought, I guess, they could afford. It also identified a number of locations of buildings, and this next slide is the blueprint document that doesn't copy very well, but I'll help you. This is the 10-acre plot right here. This is the original administration building. This is the science hall. This, of course, is the quadrangle. This is some kind of an administrative building, administrative annex. This was a dormitory. Eventually, the sign was built there. This was a different shape, but thought to be a gymnasium. And this was some kind of recitation hall, as was this building. And you see the open quadrangle. I know at a later time there was some work done that suggested when they were looking for a location for beneficence that it might be located in the center of the quad, and obviously that took place at this location. As you can see, they were planning ahead for the additional buildings that would be needed in order to address the museum's campus. Next slide shows the science building, followed by ball gym. Most of these buildings were financed through a combination of either state funds or if funds were needed to top off a project and make it totally successful, the Ball family normally put in some additional funds to add the special touches that were necessary. Next project is this was of course the library. In this part of the building there was a large recital hall inside of here. The recital hall, of course, was converted into book storage when that became necessary. So now known as North Quad. Next, actually, there was only a portion of that building that was built at that time. The right-hand side of it was built in the late 1950s. Messina Hall. You're all familiar with it. Next, this is a look west. You can see a ball gymnasium here. This is before Christie Woods really became Christie Woods. But you can see the winter shop and the level of the forest out in that area. Next shot shows a time when parking didn't seem to be a big problem on the Ball State campus. Two-way traffic going through the quad. Dean Rundell, his later plan addresses this all. Next slide is a cornerstone lane for Burris School. It was the dream of President Burris, who died at a fairly young age. This is his wife here as they're laying the cornerstone. Looking through some of these photos, it strikes me that we do groundbreakings nowadays, but we don't seem to lay cornerstones or those kinds of things. It's a part of the ceremony that's been truncated. Next slide shows the Burris School and near completion. Interesting, when the General Assembly decided that this institution needed a laboratory school, they awarded the funds to build the building with the proviso that it could not be built on the campus. It had to be built in a place with some proximity to the campus, but off of the campus property. And they appropriated additional funds so that this piece of land that wasn't at that time owned by Ball State could be purchased. Next slide shows the campus in 1929. So we have the administration building, the science hall, Burkhart building, the North Quad, was at that time the library. We have the gymnasium here, Messina Hall, Burris School, not Kelly Hall yet, and not the Fine Arts Building. As you can see, the configuration of the buildings followed pretty closely the Lowry plan. Next slide shows another, this is the cornerstone for the Fine Arts Building. And the next slide shows the topping off ceremony as the capstone was put on the top of the Fine Arts Building. This is what it looked when it was like when it was close to finished with construction, and then that's of course what it looks like today. This is an example of some of the detailing that is on that fine building. It's too bad we don't do this anymore, but it's tough to find the craftsmen that I'm sure everyone knows. It says gracious living is the finest art. Something you see and probably never read from the Bible. This is, of course, the gallery space. Some of the additional money that the Ball family gave, as this was a WPA project. And there were limits to what kind of investments you could make in special features in the building, and so this was paid for by them. This is a glass window that is in the upper area of the building, something that you don't often see, which you frequent the gallery. This is Elliott Hall. Think about an influence from another campus. This building was built in memory of Frank C. Ball's son, Frank E. Ball, who was killed in a plane crash in his, I think he was in his mid-30s. He attended Princeton and lived in a residence hall that looked nearly exactly like this. And so it was duplicated here on the campus and stands as a memorial. Beneficence is a story in itself. I assume most of you know that Beneficence was a gesture by the Muncie community to recognize the many benefactions of the Ball family, not only Ball State University, but Ball Memorial Hospital, and as well as others. The figure with the treasure chest symbolizing treasures of knowledge, the outstretched hand to demonstrate the responsibility that all educated people have to share of their resources, both mental and physical, with others. Next slide shows the sculptor, Nathaniel French. This was his last work. He was in his 70s before he was even contacted to try to it was quite a struggle, actually, to get Daniel Chester French interested in coming to the Midwest to design this recognition piece. But the more he got involved in the story and the goals and objectives, was when he agreed to take the commission. He's more famous for other sculpture in Lincoln, Nebraska, as the Standing Lincoln, and in Washington, D.C., we're all familiar with the Lincoln Memorial, and here's a statue of George Washington in Paris. He's responsible for the John Harvard statue that's on the Harvard campus and many others. This is the unveiling of the Beneficence. This is in 1937. Exactly 37. Next slide. Is a little different view of the campus. We're now flying over the hospital. These are hospital buildings here, and this is Burris School. By that time, this is Sinai Hall, the power plant, the gymnasium, fine arts is here now, the administration building. This is Elliott Hall. This is that Forest Hall building that hadn't been torn down yet. It was torn down 2 years later, and that was pretty much it. Next slide indicates the acquisitions of property that were made that enabled the campus to grow and develop in the future. There were people, of course, that thought in the late 40s that buying this, what was farmland, as well as these properties, was a pretty crazy thing to do. But someone had the foresight necessary. And the next slide is indication of the shoulder plan. I'll show you in a minute why the acquisition of that property was essential. This plan signaled the first bit of planning for development of the campus north of Riverside Avenue. It had been contained essentially on the 10 acres plus the Burris plot until that time. And of course, there were a number of building sites identified for academic buildings, some residence halls, and some athletic facilities. Next slide indicates, shows that plan. It orients you This is Riverside Avenue. This is McKinley Avenue, so now this is the Administration Building, Science Hall, Library, Fine Arts. This was, the next development after this plan was put into place was the development of the Practical Arts and Industrial Arts building located right here. You can see that there was also some thought in the future about other structures in locations where ultimately teachers' colleges resides. Here to the east, this is what ended up under construction as the English and the Music and English complex, and residence halls were planned for down in this area. Though it's interesting to note the different architectural style that was foreseen at that time and what we find today. Don't want to overlook the fact that in the previous slide, the football stadium was slated to go at just out in your front yard here. Obviously, when that football stadium was built, it was put out on the west campus, just south of the Christie Woods, and then ultimately to its current location. Next slide shows, of course, the Practical Arts building was completed in the early 1950s, followed by more land acquisition. You can see in the 1950s, in addition to the land that was acquired there in the previous period, 50s, this land was purchased. In fact, you notice in the previous buildings that the residence hall slated for here, that wasn't exactly owned yet. And this property after the north was acquired as well as the sleeping property there. Next slide shows a look at the enrollment. The university started with a rather modest enrollment of, I think, around 300 students, and it grew to the point that in the early 1960s, it actually shot up to around more than 17,000 students. And this was, of course, a major driver for the development of residence halls and academic buildings and all sorts of facilities that were needed by the campus. This is the Pine Shelf. It was evidently, prior to the Student Center, a favorite hangout for students on this campus. And it was raised in 1952, but I think in 1950, as indicated in the next slide, the ground was broken for a new student center. This is President Pittenger, who, of course, the building was named after him. The next slide shows the building in its entirety. It didn't take 10 years or nearly 10 years to build, but it was built in sections, and I think the groundbreaking related to this section and the rest of the building had been completed by 1961, the building that you see today. So we're talking about the 1960s. We're talking about a period when this graph goes straight up. I can remember I came here in 1961 as a student, and the enrollment was growing some years at 1,000 students every year. Very little place to house them, and so dramatic growth and development. Buildings were built, especially for residence hall purposes, as rapidly as they could be planned and built. Next slide shows one of the Ball State buildings at that time in the 1960s. This is North and South Hall. It is located on the property where the Teachers College now is. This is right outside the music building. This is the sidewalk that we use every day as you move through this part of the campus. McKinley Avenue, this scramble up over here. Next slide shows the Teachers College building built in that particular location. In the 1960s, other important land was acquired at the north end and some selected properties down south. You'll see as time goes by that all of this land becomes essential to fulfilling the vision of our current plan. Next slide identifies in very summary form some of the ingredients of the Perkins and Wilk plan. As I think back through some of the while there were lots of different important components in the plan, this probably identified an arrangement of space on this campus that kind of goes like this. At the center core is the arrangement of academic buildings, not probably rocket science, but buildings hadn't been located north of the music building at that time in this quadrangle that we know today. And in fact, the library had not been quite located yet. That was a discussion item. There was in place Neuer Hall, built in 1964, and the question was, what should be the development in that particular area? At that time that this plan was put into place, it was forecasted that Ball State's enrollment would be around 25,000 and still growing. And so it was very important to try to look at the best arrangement of space. So the academic buildings at the core, surrounded by residence halls and other support facilities. And then finally at the outer perimeter would be the parking facilities to support all of that. And there was also a proposed solution for McKinley Avenue, a solution that we tried to pursue in the early 80s. That solution was to close it and make it into a quad, much like you could imagine it could be. But that was not a successful effort, and so, as will be indicated in a minute, some other plans were made. Next slide shows the campus in about 1967 or 68. So again, this is Riverside, McKinley Avenue going north. The Teachers College had been in place. This was the music building. This is the English building, Emmons Auditorium, residence hall development, pretty much like it had been forecast. And an awful lot of open space. The university did not own this property right here at this time. And a plan to move forward as the next set of buildings would be built. This is what happened. You can see the space that was reserved right here at the center of the campus for the infill buildings, like the architecture building, like the Bell building, like the Widener building, and the library and all the facilities that ultimately located in the center. So that property was saved, and residence construction was built to the north and over here to the east. And of course, it was in place at the south of Redmond. Next slide, back to enrollment again. We're now in the period somewhere close to here. The enrollment is still forecasted to continue to increase, but you can see that it moderated some, and while it has increased between here and here, by and large, that back to this point right now, line right through there, it's not much. Next slide indicates the location of the library following the Perkins and Will plan. Perkins and Will incidentally designed this building after they were involved in the master planning effort. Next slide indicates the former home of the fairly new College of Architecture on the Ball State campus. This is the facility that the students here would have used prior to moving into the structure in 1972 across the street. Next slide indicates that. And then, of course, the building addition that was added a few years later. And during the 1980s, another important piece of land was acquired that was missing right here, and as well as in the south part of the campus. And it enabled us to do some special focused planning on that particular plot. Next slide mentions the Rundale-Hertzberger plan. Dean is here, and I know that this doesn't represent all his plan bodies, but several building sites were identified. In fact, we did a focus study on that plot of land that was just acquired, so that we would have the kind of analysis necessary to make the best use of that site for all future purposes. We looked at McKinley Avenue again and developed a plan that maybe you've read a little bit about in the paper as one that continues to leave traffic on McKinley, but does, we think, a lot to solve the congestion problem. We did a comprehensive parking plan that while everyone doesn't find parking to be totally handy, as university campuses go, with the shuttle bus system and the scheme that we have in place right now, it is much more efficient than it has ever been in the past. Landscape development and lots of different kinds of projects that have added to the beauty and function of the campus, forestation plans and so forth. Next slide is a summary of that plan, shows McKinney Avenue again, going back down to the campus. I would take the time to explain all the features of this plan that have yet to be put into place, but in the time allowed, we should say that for others. Next slide talks about some of the influences of technology. Don't think of the automobile as a brand new technology, but we were trying to accommodate it, and it was a primary feature of this most recent plan. But certainly television and computer technology are something that we plan for and install a great deal of infrastructure to support, as well as I mentioned before, the automobile and here it comes. One of the buildings that was built, the first one built under this plan was actually the Robert Bell building that is located here in the corner. And then, of course, the Balthazar Communications building. I didn't mention it earlier, but this plot right here is the building site for the new North Quadrangle building that we're hoping to, by the end of this month, say that we can start the planning and construction. It is under consideration right now by the General Assembly with positive recommendations so far. Of course, during this time period, the Health and Physical Activity Complex, this of course is the entrance that is out in front of the Human Performance Laboratory, but the building extends off to the north, and of course the arena that is indicated on the next slide. Next slide identifies further extension of that planning. It is still in force and underway. The Alumni Center, North Quad Academic Building, the building I mentioned a minute ago, which would house the art department, and two of the departments of the new telecommunications college would also be located there, so they have nice proximity to the other departments in the college located in the Hall Communications building. We have a site identification for a new student center to make it more of a central focus of the campus. And then some preliminary study of that project to move ahead in the period. The music recital hall is another building that is in our planning. We have some rough programmatic concepts in place. Some of these buildings will be the subject of future legislative requests, and or we are preparing a new major fundraising project right now, and they will probably find a home there as well. This is shows you what the architecture rendering of the Peggy Free designed Alumni Center will be. Another view is the next slide. The building will be completed hopefully in the fall. Other projects include gateways and entrances to the campus, a number of beautification projects. We have an active forestation plan with goals and objectives established, and we're reaching those goals and hope to exceed them between now and the year 2000. Attended to the Alumni Center, some gardens and some landscape opportunities that we planned, and that will probably go as part of the private fundraising project. Some interest in some outdoor sculptures in various locations around the campus. This is an indication of the kind of planning that is taking place related to the entrance. This would be at McKinley Avenue and Bethel Avenue, which at this point is the primary entrance to the campus. If you ever think about it, when you get to that intersection and look around, there's no indication that there's anything down the road, no signage to speak of that represents the kind of institution and that is one reason why the designers have been very, very careful in selecting the kind of building materials and so that the gateway represents what we found behind. The next slide talks about the Carroll and McKinley Avenue project, which developed under the Hershberger study. Obviously, when you include the safety, the infrastructure, the street, it actually is kind of a country road that has had asphalt on top of it and on the sides over the years. There's no really drainage systems or stormwater, and that's why it is not possible. It is possible to put pavement over it, but in a few years, it can easily be predicted that it will need to be surfacing in, and that's been the pattern through the years. And so we will add the necessary infrastructure. It will provide a major unifying element to this quadrant. The next slide shows what we have running through the center of the campus as a kind of a minor level interstate. You can be fairly comfortable when you get to this point to rip up to about 45 miles an hour. So especially because the street is so wide, it simply has never had the kind of design that's necessary and is too dominant. This is a vehicular dominant zone in a pedestrian area. You notice this is kind of an old slide because there are a couple of buildings that were located here before long another building located there. This is an old story. This is, of course, what you see when you're going north. You have a picture over here, library here. This is a space that's void of any dimension or scale or design or take your pick. It's a pretty sad place. The concept is to have the tower and to provide a one-way north lane and another lane south. And this would make a major change and provide a unifying element. And, by the way, this rendering is kind of interesting. When you look at it, the longer you look at it, you see another sub-rendering here and another here. And this was done by a fellow who now makes his living as a professional renderer, and he was a faculty member on this campus in the College of Architecture. Dean, what's his name? Jim Anderson. Wasn't he a landscape architectural faculty member here? Great job. Next slide is back to the overall campus. Here's the location for the new quadrangle building and the space that is being reserved for the moment based on some studies that have been done from students who's located near other building sites. But let's stop right there, and you've been kind enough to be here for 1 hour. Let's go to the questions if you have. So Scott, take it away.
I believe you said 1918, the ball club was donated 120 acres, 60 acres went to the campus. What happened to the other? What were the other 60 acres?
The instruction was to give 60 acres to the Indiana State Normal School and take the other 60 acres and put them in a trust. So a trust was established and all that land was then put in the care of the trust. And then over a period of time, when a whole variety of, like the State Budget Committee at one point called on some of those funds, and Indiana State trustees did. So the idea was that those funds, that land had value. It wasn't part of the central part of the campus, and they could be sold in order to do further development on the campus area. So it's kind of an endowment.
What was that property sold for?
What was it you said? Some parcels, for instance, are you familiar with where the Cobalt Dairy used to be? It's up Nichols. Pardon? Yeah, Nichols and Dunn. So there were some properties up in that area. There were some properties the Woodworth residence halls, for instance. Some of them were kind of stray properties that were kind of sprinkled around. And there was, as I said, a real fear that that adding another university was really going to draw away from resources. That sounds more like the conversation we had on this campus when someone has an idea for a new campus.
I was wondering, what about neighborhood in the campus? Do you see more landscaping, or what direction more land? Are neighborhoods around us?
The properties that were located, for instance, south of the student center were all acquired one property at a time as property owners wanted to sell, and we declared an interest in buying if we could come to a reasonable price. And some of those properties we still don't own, because obviously the price is not quite reasonable. But I think in the period ahead, the area east of McKinley Avenue, not as far down as to the village, I think is an area that where we would make some reasonable acquisitions. I think the north of Neely, as it goes this side of New York, is an area that when you look at the overall campus plan, of course, you say what we need to do is buy Westwood. That's not a proposal. In fact, you know, Westwood really adds to the value of the campus, the ambience of what we have here, and so we have no plans. Right. Maybe we have a willing buyer, but do we have a reasonable buyer is the question. I mean, a seller.
So, wondering if you could tell us a little bit about plans for lovely building, which is now the Alumni House.
The question is, what is to happen with the Elliott Apartments or the Alumni House? Interesting, that building was built as a piece of rental property by Frankie Ball, the fellow who died in the airplane crash, and I guess maybe I read that in some literature. But I think long term, it will be a building site. It is a pretty miserable, it is a good looking building, there's no question about it. But it is a pretty miserable facility from a facility standpoint. It's, the termites are, it's not quite like North and South Quad, North and South Hall were, for those who remember before those were only down. But in the near term, it has life serving one department or another.
What happened to the old food?
The question is, what happens to the old student center if we build a new one? And that's an excellent question. That is very much part of some preliminary planning that's ongoing right now. It's the same as saying I've heard of some ideas, but I don't think they're good enough to repeat.
Other questions? Any of the students who are working in the North Quad have any questions for Mr. Kinghorn?
How possible is this idea of the bell tower? Is that anything you expect to see?
Very possible. And we have been, in the last 5 or 6 years, just a phone call away. We thought we had a donor that was interested. And it got involved in some tax issue and it got too complicated, and so moved away. But I think it is a feature. It is clear clear that you don't need to have a bell tower in order to have university. But when you have one, you have something that a lot of places don't have, and it's a special kind of feature. And I think that probably on part of our next fundraising campaign is, in my mind, if you're interested in a naming opportunity, it is the best, the most noticeable, and the lowest cost naming opportunity we can come up with. I was visiting with a couple who are really up in their years, and they wanted to know about the campus plan. They have more than sufficient resources to do anything that we could think of in this campus. And the individual was husband and wife, and she was starting to talk about bell tower. Of course, I got excited about that. How much would that be? Reasonable, that's what I said.
So the money isn't raised as of yet for the bell tower?
That's correct.
Why was there a rerouting of the idea of
It wasn't given up. It was pursued to the point that in order to make a change, to close the street, it had to be vacated by the city. And we were all, but my vote count was one or two votes short, being able to have that accomplished. We spent months going through deliberations, arguments, and presentations to neighborhood people, and in the final analysis, there were many people who found it difficult in this area, found it difficult to change their driving patterns. And there frankly weren't any votes on McKinley Avenue. No one lives there that votes, and so it came down to some practical politics, and it was not possible to close it. I think, though, the solution that we have right now to bring into balance both the pedestrian and the vehicle with controlled crosswalks will provide the safety that is necessary. You'll be able to walk to the center and then look the other direction and then cross. And I think as a package, it was difficult, for instance, for a lot of the folks that use it all the time to think that right now, for instance, and there probably is not a great volume of student or pedestrian traffic across the street, but they couldn't use it. They have to go out of their way. Just changing these.
What kind of student and faculty involvement is involved in the process of coming up with these new buildings and new plans?
Quite a bit. A whole variety of ways. The faculty, for instance, when this building was built, played a major role in planning this particular structure as well as the district. The faculty in the art department and the journalism department and the speech communications department will be part of the team that will plan the new North Quad as an example. And so it is that librarians were intimately involved in planning the library. So if it's building specific, they are integral to the building committee. As far as the master plan, for instance, that was developed, that was a process that involved lots of different people. We made presentations, I can't tell you the number, with some of the earlier drafts to groups here, other places, and they made suggestions, and by virtue of those suggestions, this plan is substantially different than it was before that. But the shame is that a lot of people that made suggestions, asked questions, encourage us to probe even deeper into analyzing the situation, don't know that it was changed based on their question or their idea. But this thing takes place over a long period of time. No way to do that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yours?
Ms. Walker here?
Yes.
Why is the chain fence blocking people from taking the easement?
Because people don't have a respect for the properties, I think. One of the reasons, and it's really a shame that there have to be even those temporary barriers. I guess it's a question. We have, I think, an incredible facility here, and the good news is that I know no one who is interested in architecture and facilities and grounds and all that does these types of things. But other students that don't have any respect for the environment, for instance, do that. And as nicely as we can, we provide gentle notification. When John Emmons was president of Ball State years ago, if he saw someone walking across the grass, he'd open his window and say, "Get off the grass!" Well, I have not been doing that. But anyway, I mean, it's a shame. I hate it.
Can't hear your question.
With the intersection of Ewing and Kiley, as a Michelin group student, I noticed a small problem trying to cross there. It's kind of confusing, just like the streets or something. I think it's easier in any way.
And McKinley and Neely,
The question was whether or not the intersection at the corner of McKinley and Neely was going to be changed to improve its use by the visually impaired student population.
I'm not aware of the difficulty that you're having, but you need to let us know. If there's something that we can do to improve the negotiation in that area, we certainly do it. What can you, well, maybe we can talk afterwards, but I'd be very interested in knowing what the difficulty is so that we can try to address it.
I think there was one question here.
Now here's a real historian.
One of the great features I think that I have always thought that's important for Ball State is the census repair and renovation program. I think that comes under planning or something like that. So the exception of many of the sewer buildings, full 75, the Black Library, things like that. The residence halls, North Quad, Wall Gym now, undergone extensive multi-million-dollar renovations. Can you go into that, can you explore how, once these buildings are put up and then they're used, and then how you analyze the usage, and how you roll up the costs to make them more modern?
Well, sometimes we're more successful than others. As you suggest, these rehabilitation projects are extensive and very expensive. And so, for instance, while the last building approval we had prior to the one we're working on right now was 10 years ago, in the meantime, we've been doing major rehabilitation work on Boris School, on Rosina, and certainly the Burkhardt building was a major renovation project. What am I missing? Must be another building. Some of the administration building, ball gym. So the process is actually the same for a major project like that as it is for a new building. We worked for, I can't remember exactly how many years, to get the legislative attention to the ball building. It was really in disrepair, but it took substantial funds. And I can remember when we were working on funds to redo the Burkhardt building, the budget committee, and these are the 8 key legislators that essentially make all the big decisions related to finance for the state of Indiana. When they came for one of the campus tours, every other year we have them on the campus and we tour all of our critical facilities and recognize their efforts on the new facilities. And one of the members of the budget committee said, "If you don't take me down in the basement of the science building again, I will be very positive in trying," because he's not been down there so many times. So it takes, in the Burris building was the same. So it just takes, in the legislative process, there's very little political congratulations in a rehabilitation project compared with getting a new building. And we're also very fortunate that the General Assembly in Indiana is very much committed to renewal and replacement funds. Not true in a lot of other states. But these key legislative leaders believe that, in fact, they spend a lot of time thinking about allocating a new building because they know that's just the beginning of a long line of additional appropriations that will be needed in order to maintain that facility over time. And so, in fact, during this current legislative session, they are planning to fund the rehabilitation formula at the 100% level. So it's a combination.
Ian, you had a question? No, Eric?
Are there any considerations being made for disabled persons who are needed in their additions?
I'm sorry.
Are there any considerations for the disabled being made if they're needed in new additions?
Oh, yes. In fact, the question had to do with accommodations for disabled students in new buildings or renovation projects. I guess the answer is yes. The code requires it. We go beyond the code in most situations. That has been a focus of Ball State University for the last 25 years. In fact, if you look at the number of disabled students that attend this institution, there are many more because of those accommodations.
How can we find the specifics on that?
If you have a different building that you want to talk about, facilities planning and management, but if you'd like to have kind of an overview, if you talk with Rich Harris in the disabled student office, he can address those kinds of needs. If you've been to the computer center across the street, anyone who's not been to that the facility there and had a chance to witness the computer technology that is of great assistance, essential to many students in attending this institution, you ought to do that.
Tom, I don't remember, I think we simply passed over the plan for more commentary on by mentioning reforestation. And they don't know where they have it. Is the plans for reforestation?
Well, and we had been working on this on a regular basis through the years, but I think it was 1990 was the year that we started. We pulled a group together and said we need to make sure that 50 years from now that this campus has the kind of appeal that it could have with the kind of vegetation. So we established some goals. We wanted to, Ron Spangler was involved in this, we wanted to triple the number of species of trees and shrubs that were located on campus. We wanted to more than double the number of plants and trees on the campus. We wanted to plant them in areas where they would be available for student study. So we worked with faculty, Ron in landscape architecture, and folks in natural resources and biology, and identifying the kinds of materials that would be of best use and location on the campus. And I think right now we're quite a bit ahead of that plan. Or at least we're planning to reach our goals by the year 2000. The other thing we've done that I hope that you noticed, though there's not great reason to, when we develop parking facilities as a part of the Rindell-Winsberger plan, we design what we think of as parking parks, not plain old parking lots where you throw a strip of asphalt down. And I'm anxious for those trees that we planted in all those islands, gave up some parking places they have in the islands. I'm anxious for them to grow and mature and provide the canopy that will reduce the heat island effect that is always attendant to other parking facilities. So we hope that in the future there's a measure of difference that people can enjoy.
I was wondering, have you considered the pattern of movement through the North Quad, considering that with disrespect to the land or not, people are going to be walking through the grass, and students are, in the next 10 years, they're going to be doing the same thing. The path is going to be created because of the efficiency in which they see where they want to go. And that disrespect to the land is going to be there. The inefficiency of this path, this east-west path down the middle, I don't see its efficiency. at all as compared to the path in which students are taking. And that's the path across the tracks.
And that's a reality, there's no question about it. The campus has to function. Maybe we ought to do a survey if anyone's using the sidewalks that we put in, and maybe we ought to take those up and put them where the paths are. It's certainly a legitimate point. But I think, by the same token, no one would want us to continue paving until everyone is satisfied. So it's got some kind of balance. Yeah, that's a good point.
We'll make this the last question. One last question.
What are the plans for a new multicultural building?
Plans for a new multicultural building. There aren't any specific plans at this time, though the Student Center and in its new form has a thought, a conversation about something to expand the multicultural. But a new standalone building for that particular function is not part of our plan. Though the Student Center offers a real opportunity.
The new student center or the building?
Could be either. A lot of talk about the new Student Center, but when it all shakes out, it could be one place or the other. Still, that whole idea is still, we have determined that there is a site sufficient, but we have not determined the number of floors, the layout, and all that. So there is some flexibility. It is clear, though, that long range, the house that is currently serving that purpose will not function. So,
one of the things that Tom was very proud about as he and I talked before the presentation was that since 1972, in the buildings that have been planned and built on this campus, graduates from the College of Architecture and Planning have been instrumental in those buildings. And so Tom was very proud about the fact that the students that are here and the faculty who are here are all seen by the administration as people who are contributing to the future of this university. And we'd like to thank Tom for his time tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before you leave, I should have done this before. Jim Bassett is here, and Jim, would you please stand and raise your hand? A graduate of this college. He was a principal at MSKTD. They were the firm responsible for the development of the Ball Telecommunications building. Dean Rundell is seated next to him. You've heard talk about the Rundell-Ernstberger report. This is Dean Rundell. I understand he's teaching a class right now, as is his colleague, Eric Ernstberger. So, and Ron Slangler is working on the project. So, Ball State College of Architecture and graduates are well represented in this